and welcome. I'm Asuma Kataoka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has arrived in Kyiv as a special guest for Ukraine's Independence Day. Vowing unwavering support, US President Donald Trump's envoy Keith Kellogg also joined the celebrations, with President Volodymyr Zelensky confirming his presence as Ukraine courts Washington's backing to end the war. Russia and Ukraine have exchanged 146 prisoners of war each, even as a Ukrainian drone strike damaged a transformer at the Kursk nuclear power plant, sparking a fire without casualties or radiation leaks. Meanwhile, a fire at Russia's Novochakstinsk refinery hit by Ukrainian drone on Thursday has been burning for 4 days straight. Israeli planes and tanks struck eastern and northern Gaza City overnight, leveling homes in Zaytun, Shijaya, and Jabalia. As residents fled under heavy shelling, the assault comes as a global hunger monitor confirms famine in Gaza City, even as Israeli leaders vow to press ahead with full takeover. Britain will reform its asylum appeal system by creating an independent body of adjudicators to cut a backlog of 106,000 cases and to phase out the use of hotels, costing billions annually. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Labour government under pressure as immigration polls as the public's top 10 concern. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has declared that Tehran will not be obedient to US demands, vowing to stand strongly against pressure for direct negotiations. According to local state media, Khamenei said the issue with Washington is unsolvable. Bangladesh and Pakistan agreed to strengthen long-strained relations with new trade and cultural agreements, but Dhaka has said that its demand for an apology over the 1971 war atrocities remains unresolved, while Islamabad's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar has the most senior official to visit Dhaka since 2012, hailed tremendous potential between the two countries. Three former presidents of Sri Lanka have all condemned the jailing of a 76-year-old ex-president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, as a calculated assault on democracy, calling the charges over his alleged 55,000 use of state funds frivolous, while Wickremesinghe was rushed to the ICU in Colombo due to severe health issues while in custody, fueling outrage. The Nigerian Air Force have rescued 76 kidnapped victims, including women and children, after a precision airstrike on a bandit stronghold in Katsina State. Though one child has died in this operation, the strike targeted a gang led by Babaro marks a potential breakthrough against criminal networks terrorizing northwest Nigeria. US President Donald Trump's envoy Keith Kellogg and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney attended Ukraine's Independence Day celebrations in Kyiv today, a symbolic show of support as the war enters its fourth year. Carney says he would not rule out presence of Canadian troops in Ukraine as part of future security guarantees, and Ukraine has recently used its own weapons to strike targets in Russia and does not consult Washington about these operations. Meanwhile, on the global front, world leaders have marked Ukraine's 34th Independence Day with strong messages of support. Pope Leo has offered prayers for Ukraine's wounded and grieving, urging an end to violence. King Charles and Turkish President Erdogan hailed Ukraine's resilience and vowed continued partnership. French President Emmanuel Macron reaffirmed military and economic support, while China's Xi Jinping focused on bilateral cooperation. From Europe, leaders including Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and NATO sent powerful messages of unity. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson criticized Hungary for aligning with Russia. President of Belarus Alexander Lukashenko urged peace and unity, referencing shared history with Ukraine. President Zelensky responded with a message of strength, declaring Ukraine is seen as a strong ally across the world and will secure peace through strong guarantees. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Envoy Latham. He's a professor of international relations, joins us live from Minnesota. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, what is the significance of this Ukraine striking targets inside of Russia without consulting Washington?
Well, we're getting some conflicting reports there. Washington does have legal authority over end use of certain systems. And we've just read this morning in various news outlets that Washington has not permitted Ukraine to use certain weapons against targets inside Russia. Now, perhaps Ukraine is stretching the rules a little bit. Certainly, it has every incentive, military incentive, to use those weapons to strike deeply inside Russia against oil infrastructure and command and control and things like that. I think we need to wait and see exactly what's going on here. The last thing in the world President Zelensky wants to do, as he learned back in February, is irritate President Donald Trump. And this would certainly constitute an irritant.
And does this demonstrate growing Ukrainian military autonomy, or does it risk straining alliances?
Well, I think both, and it does. Ukraine is increasingly desperate. It's facing a manpower crisis. It's unable to field the kinds of forces it needs to. Even if it gets the weapons, it increasingly has nobody to use the weapons. The situation on the battlefield is not unfolding in Kyiv's favor. Russia is making incremental and very costly advances, but advances nonetheless. It looks like negotiations aren't going to yield anything at all, certainly not anything in Ukraine's favor. And so I think we see desperation, not only on the part of Kyiv, but on the part of partner and allied countries as well. Mark Carney, who is incapable of funding the Canadian armed forces sufficiently, has pledged $1 billion of support to Ukraine. These are signals of solidarity, but they're also signals, I think, of desperation.
Talking about signals, what do you think high-profile appearances by figures like Keith Kellogg signals?
I think in the Western world, there are the vast majority of people, especially within the foreign policy establishment, are inclined to support Ukraine and are inclined to make that support known in whatever way that they can. It's worth pointing out that that is not a perspective shared in the global South, for example. China is, for example, quite scrupulous in terms of the way it signals its so-called neutrality, equidistance from both Ukraine and Russia, while, of course, all the while supplying Russia with everything short of weapons that it needs to prosecute this war.
Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, in a major prisoner exchange, 146 Russian servicemen have been returned from Ukrainian-controlled territory, with Ukraine receiving an equal number of its own soldiers in return. Among those freed are 8 Russian civilians from the Kursk region, reportedly detained illegally by Ukrainian authorities. The Russian soldiers are currently in Belarus while they are undergoing medical and psychological care. They will soon be transferred to Russia for further treatment under the Ministry of Defense. The United Arab Emirates played a key humanitarian role in mediating this exchange, highlighting ongoing international efforts to support prisoner swaps amid the ongoing conflict. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Envoy Latham. He's a professor of international relations, joins us live from Minnesota. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, what is the role of UAE in mediating this exchange, and what does this suggest about maybe evolving landscape of global diplomatic players in this conflict?
Well, it underscores a reality which unfortunately President Trump seems not to understand, that we are in, he gets this part, we're in a multipolar world in which various countries have great power status, whether regionally or globally. So China globally, Saudi Arabia regionally. But there's also a game that these countries are playing now, which is sort of unprecedented, which is multi-alignment. That sometimes countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are supporting the United States, and other times they're supporting Russia, and other times they're on Team China. And that fluidity is something that President Trump can't really wrap his head around, I think. Just ask the Indians in New Delhi, they'll tell you that he's incapable of grasping that. Now, when it comes to the UAE, they have aspirations to be a regional great power in the Persian Gulf region. How do you be a great power? Well, on the one hand, you need wealth. On the other hand, you need some military capabilities. But increasingly, you need soft power. You need diplomatic sway. And so for the UAE to wade in on this and say, hey, world, look at us. We're the peacemakers. We're trying to bridge the differences between Russia and Ukraine. We have relationships with both. Take us seriously, please. That will work if it works. If it goes nowhere, it will underscore or give the impression that UAE is maybe a regional player, but is not really a global great power.
And building on your answers, do you think we will see more non-Western actors take on mediation roles in the future?
Well, I think so. I think there are a lot of countries, some of which are nominally Western. Turkey, for example, part of NATO, but not really part of Western Europe for historical and contemporary reasons. We see countries in the greater Middle East, the Persian Gulf region, trying to play that role. We see regionally countries which we would have written off 15 or 20 years ago, Rwanda, for example, playing the role of regional great power, doing peacekeeping and supporting military efforts in the Congo, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we go farther east, we see India increasingly playing that role. India is not a trivial or small country, 1.4 billion people, but it's beginning to play a regional and global role that it hasn't played in the past. And then if you go farther east, even countries like Japan, which was chastened, of course, after the Second World War, is increasingly trying to play a constructive, what we used to call middle power role, but it's really a great power role on the world stage. So yes, this is a phenomenon that the American administration under President Trump needs to wrap its head around because it's not going away.
And lastly, looking at this POW exchange, latest one, what does this latest prisoner exchange reveal about the current state of diplomacy? Is there any change that's happened, or it's the same between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, this is not a precursor or a prelude or even a premonition of some kind of profoundly improved diplomatic relations between Ukraine and Russia. That's simply not in the cards at the moment. There was a brief moment at Anchorage where maybe we thought this might happen. And then again in Washington, we thought these relations might yield negotiations, but that's not really what's happening here. What is happening is historically precedented back-channel negotiations or low-key diplomatic negotiations that benefit both sides. Both sides want their prisoners returned, not because they'll be returned to the front lines. They won't. They'll be incapacitated for a long time, but to satisfy domestic audiences that the respective governments are looking out for the respective sons and brothers and fathers of important constituencies back home. So this has happened in many wars. This is not unprecedented. But it is important to those families and those POWs. But what it doesn't do is signal a tectonic shift in the diplomatic relations between Moscow and Kyiv.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Andrew
Very
Latham, for joining us and sharing your insight throughout this topic. Thank you very much. Now we move on to Middle East. According to reports, U.S. Envoy Tom Barrack has arrived in Israel and has met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today for high-level talks amid growing regional and diplomatic tensions. This comes as Israeli planes and tanks bombed Gaza City overnight, targeting the eastern and northern outskirts, destroying homes and buildings as residents fled or hid in fear. Israel says these strikes aim to destroy Hamas tunnels and strengthen control, with plans to seize the city in the coming weeks. Defense Minister Israel Katz warned Gaza City would be razed unless Hamas agrees to end the war and release hostages. Hamas has rejected Israel's approach, calling a ceasefire the only way to return hostages. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Alon Levi. He's a former spokesperson for the State of Israel, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you, Alon, for joining us. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, with the defense minister's warning also about this razing of Gaza City entirely, how does Israel military still justify continued strikes amid growing concerns over the civilian safety as well as hostage safety?
Yeah, nearly 2 years ago, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas started a war, and Israel wants to end that war now. Israel wants to end the war with all the hostages Hamas took back home, safe with their families, and with Hamas removed from power so it can never invade again, massacre Israelis at a music festival, commit barbaric acts of sexual violence, and take more hostages. What's the problem? Hamas is refusing to give back the hostages, and it's refusing to end the war. It wants to pause the war in a way that will let it catch its breath and then try to do the October 7th massacre again and again, as it has been promising, because it's a jihadi death cult whose goal is the destruction, the obliteration of the state of Israel. So Israel is telling Hamas now, we want to end this war, but that war has to end with all the hostages home and with Hamas disarmed, so we don't go back to another war again.
And what measures, if any, are being taken to distinguish Hamas and civilian people?
That's an excellent question. Since Hamas declared this war nearly 2 years ago, Israel has been saying this is a war against Hamas and not the people of Gaza. And that is why Israel is trying to evacuate the population of Gaza to safer areas in the south. The problem in Gaza City is that the Hamas terrorists are trying to use civilians as human shields to hide behind. Hamas is fighting from a network of tunnels underneath people's feet, with the shafts opening up in schools and homes and mosques and hospitals. And obviously it's impossible to reach those military targets if there are people directly above them. So Israel is telling civilians, we're giving you time, we're delaying the full invasion of Gaza City. We want you to go south where we can set up field hospitals and tent cities and make sure you have access to humanitarian aid. And I think all humanitarian agencies who really care about the people of Gaza need to be working with Israel to make sure that civilians escape a war zone where Hamas terrorists are trying to hide behind them. It is unconscionable and wrong to keep civilians trapped inside a battle zone. They should be helped to evacuate.
Yes, and now looking at the news we just read, Elon, what was discussed, what do you think was discussed during U.S. Envoy Tom Barrack's meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think the Trump administration knows that wars should end with peace, not a piece of paper, and it wants to leverage Israel's amazing victory over Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy army in Lebanon, to promote normalization in the region. That's what President Trump wants to be his legacy, and it's what Netanyahu wants to be his legacy as well. Normal, peaceful relations between Israel and neighboring countries. So now that Hezbollah has been weakened and Lebanon is disarming it, now that Syria is no longer controlled by the Assad regime, which was an ally of the Iranian regime, the Americans want to promote peace and normalization. So I expect they'll be looking into steps that can be taken on both sides to make sure that this war that the Iranian Axis declared against Israel nearly 2 years ago ends with an outbreak of peace in the region and doesn't just take us backwards to the same circumstances that led to this war in the first place.
Thank you very much, Elon Levi, for joining us and sharing your insight as a former spokesperson for the State of Israel. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic now. In the latest developments, the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has called for firm international measures and binding practical arrangements to stop the war in Gaza. This statement has come after World Food Programme's declaration of famine in certain areas of Gaza. The ministry has stated the Gaza famine is not natural and is the direct result of intentional Israeli policy. The ministry has also stated that it is intensifying its political, legal, and diplomatic efforts to build international front and to pressure Israel to stop the offensive. This statement has come at a time when there are fears of the expansion of famine in other areas of Gaza. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Elon Levi. Thank you, Elon, for staying with us. Now, from what you have seen or heard in Israel, what is the reality of the Palestinian situation about the famine in Gaza?
The reality is that since Hamas declared this brutal war nearly 2 years ago, Israel has conducted the biggest military operation ever to feed the enemy's civilians. Since the start of the war, Israel has delivered nearly 2 million tons of aid into Gaza. That's 100,000 trucks. I mean, it's enough that if you lined them bumper to bumper, they'd go from Gaza to Damascus and back. So the allegations that Israel is trying to starve the people of Gaza are just completely out of touch with reality. And considering the amount of food that has gone into Gaza. Now look, there is hunger, there is suffering. There is suffering because the Hamas regime is hijacking aid for its fighters, and because we've seen a catastrophic collapse of UN aid distribution systems in Gaza, with 90% of the aid getting hijacked and looted on the way. That's according to UN numbers. The problem isn't getting aid into Gaza. Israel's letting plenty of aid into Gaza. The problem is getting it around. And there is no famine in Gaza now. And we know that because if there were famine, you'd see 200 people dying every single day of hunger. And that simply isn't the case. In order to reach the declaration of famine, the UN just assumed, with no reason, 30 times as many deaths by malnutrition as there are in reality. And look, I think India is no stranger to examples of UN officials acting in an unprofessional way because they're pursuing a political agenda. We all remember the infamous UN reports about Kashmir from 6 or 7 years ago, which India called the UN out for and said it was based on biased sources and that it was legitimizing Pakistani terrorism. We remember the example from just a few months ago of Volker Turk, the UN human rights chief, who called India out for its actions in Manipur and Kashmir, and India called him out as well for using loose terminology and cherry picking and pursuing a political agenda. And Israel is facing the exact same thing now. We have UN officials who want to end the war that Hamas started with Hamas still in power. And they want to deflect responsibility for the catastrophic failure of the UN's aid distribution system. So instead of taking responsibility, they're blaming Israel for not letting aid into Gaza, even though it's let in nearly 2 million tons of aid into Gaza. More than enough food for every man, woman, and child in the Gaza Strip.
Yes, you've mentioned that, but what about these visuals coming in, Elon, of the kids starving and people being killed just to get some food? What about these visuals? How can you explain those?
Hamas and its backers have been waging a very effective propaganda war against Israel. And that's why basically every image that we've seen in the media of starving children, it turned out they had congenital diseases. They had degenerative genetic diseases. Just today on the front page of the British Daily Mirror, a child looking hungry, he has Fanconi syndrome. It means it's not that he's not getting food, it's that his body doesn't know how to absorb nutrients. And children like that don't just need more boxes of food, they need medical evacuation. And that is why Israel is encouraging the international community to take children with diseases and treat them in their hospitals. But unfortunately, Hamas has been taking these images of very sick children. The media have been running with them, and that is not reflective of the reality on the ground, in which we're seeing 300 trucks of aid going into Gaza every single day. No army in the history of the world has ever delivered so much food into enemy-held territory, even as it knows the enemy is hijacking aid, taxing aid, and here's the most important thing, starving hostages. Hamas is starving the hostages in the dungeons of Gaza deliberately. It forced one of them to dig his own grave for the cameras. They need urgent medical attention. They need access to the Red Cross, and they need food now. The food that Israel is letting into Gaza is not getting into the hostages who look like living skeletons in the tunnels underneath Gaza now.
Yes, Elon, thank you for joining us, sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay in the Middle East now. Now we move on to our next news. Israeli airstrikes have reportedly targeted the Yemeni capital Sanaa. according to the Houthi media reports. The strikes are being described as aggression. Residents also confirmed that explosions were heard near the presidential complex and missile bases in the city. The full extent of the damage and casualties, if any, is still unknown. This marks a significant escalation of the region. Now we go back to our discussion with Alon Levi. He's a former spokesperson for the State of Israel. Joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you, Alon, for staying with us. Now, what more can you tell us about the situation between Yemen, particularly Houthi, and Israel?
Israel is taking action against the Houthi regime because in the last 2 years they have fired hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones at Israeli civilians. On Friday night, I was sitting around the dinner table in Tel Aviv with my family for dinner, and suddenly the siren went off, and everyone had to run into the basement for shelter because the Houthis in Yemen had fired a ballistic missile at Israel. And not just a ballistic missile. It turns out the Iranian regime has been supplying the Houthis with cluster warheads, which means that they explode and scatter in order to cause maximum indiscriminate damage against civilians. The Houthi pirates in Yemen, who have been firing ballistic missiles at Israel, are an Iranian proxy army. Just like Hamas is an Iranian proxy army, just like Hezbollah in Lebanon is an Iranian proxy army. And the war that we've been witnessing in the last 2 years, the October 7th war, is a war in which Israel has been under attack on 7 fronts by the Iranian regime and its proxy armies that are deliberately firing missiles at Israeli civilians, trying to kill as many people as possible. So Israel will be hoping now to send a very clear message to the Houthi regime in Yemen. It cannot continue to fire ballistic missiles at Israeli families and not pay a price. That aggression by the Houthi terrorist regime and its Iranian backers, it must end, and the people of Israel must be allowed to live in peace.
Yes, and Alon, you've mentioned that from your personal experience. Thank you for sharing that. You were eating dinner and you had to go down to a bunker. Is it like a reoccurring thing? Is this often that you have to go down to your bunker because of these attacks?
Yeah, this doesn't normally make international headlines, but the Houthis have fired hundreds of missiles at Israel in the last 2 years. Not just the Houthis, Hamas from Gaza, Hezbollah from Lebanon. We've even had drones and missiles fired by Iranian militias in Iraq. And Israelis are well trained what to do. There are days when this is a daily occurrence, where suddenly there is a siren and you have to run for shelter in the basement, if you have a basement, or wait in the stairwell, or go to a public shelter. It's obviously very difficult for elderly people and disabled people who can't go in time. But since the beginning of the October 7th war, the Iranian Axis has fired thousands of missiles at Israel, and Israel is fighting now to keep its people safe and stop those terrorist groups from firing missiles at our people several times a day sometimes, and forcing people to run to shelter.
Thank you very much, Alon Levi, for joining us as a former spokesperson for the State of Israel and sharing your insight from Tel Aviv. This is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.